how rich would Steve Jobs be today? Hi, thanks for watching Celebrities and Famous. Steve Jobs is one of the most revolutionary men in history, with different contributions such as computer phones and the mouse, in addition to its decisive legacies with Pixar and, of course, Apple. In the last few years after Steve's death, the wealth of tech companies soared as they made tens of billions of dollars each year. More importantly, Apple's shares themselves grew 81% in 2020 alone. Participation in Apple. So, how much would Steve Jobs be worth today? Well, for starters, let's take a look at Steve Jobs' stake in Apple over the years. Steve Jobs created Apple with Steve Wozniak in 1976, but considering they didn't have a lot of capital to invest in the company and the fact that equity also needed to be shared with other key voices in the company, Steve Jobs started with a modest stake of 26% at Apple after its first round of financing in 1977. In 1985, however, this participation would be diluted to less than half of that, 11%. At this point, for a variety of reasons, Steve Jobs actually left or was fired from Apple. He says he left, but many reports suggest he was fired. Anyway, he left Apple in 1985, and Steve Jobs, being Steve Jobs, decided it would be a great idea to sell his entire stake as a symbolic move that he didn't need Apple. Now, Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, and during that time, although Apple has had some notable launches, the company was experiencing a strong downtrend and was on the verge of bankruptcy. Considering this, you would think that Steve Jobs made the right move, as he should be able to buy back for a cheaper price than when he left. But that was during the dot-com bubble, so even though Apple was in a worse position, its stock price was actually much higher. When Steve Jobs left Apple in September 1985, Apple's shares were worth just 7 cents per unit. He would not become CEO again until September 1997. However, he would become financially rewarded significantly in the company once again during December 1996. At the time, Apple's stock was actually worth 21 cents a unit. Turns out these two values are crumbs compared to today's stock price. However, this back and forth movement greatly diluted Steve's position in the company. When he left, he was able to cash out $21.43 million, which he put into a number of investments, including a company called Next. Next Computer was a computer and software company that Steve hoped would grow big enough to compete with Apple one day. Although the company has never grown this much, it allowed Steve Jobs to re-enter Apple, as Apple bought Next in December 1996. Apple bought the company for a solid $400 million, but Steve's stake in the company earned him only $1.5 million shares of Apple stock. This may sound like a lot, and in fact, it is. However, compared to his original participation, this was nothing. To put this in perspective, let's take a look at how many stocks would be today. Since 1997, Apple had a total of 4 stock splits, which has led to each share of Apple today being worth 112 times less in terms of company ownership compared to shares in 1997. As a result, Steve Jobs' $1.5 million shares in 1997 would be the same as 168 million shares today. While that's a lot of shares, if Steve Jobs hadn't sold his shares in a rage in 1985, he would have had 1.8081 billion shares. Therefore, that fiasco reduced Steve's property 11 times, reducing his percentage of ownership to just under 1%. But that's not where the story ended either. You see, at this point, Steve Jobs was simply financially rewarded at the company, and although he held a consultant role, he was not yet the CEO. In early 1997, Apple tried to name a man named Gil Amelio as its CEO, but Steve Jobs was not a fan of this chant and was going to sell his entire stake again to protest the appointment. Steve Jobs got what he wanted, and Gil Amelio's appointment was cancelled. Thereafter, Steve Jobs was named CEO again in September 1997. As his first and only compensation, Steve received 5.5 million shares of 2011, which is the same as 1.375 million shares of 1997. With that, Steve Jobs successfully diluted his stake by another 10%. But as he used to say, he didn't enjoy Apple for the money, and that would be clear for the next 14 years. Steve Jobs received a $1 salary for the rest of his time at Apple, and this was a true $1 salary as he no longer received any stock compensation like many CEOs do today. From all of this, we can deduce that Steve was left with about 5.5 million shares of Apple at the time of his death, or the same as 154 million shares today. That translates to $2.34 billion at the time of his death, or $20.43 billion today. But wait, there is something wrong with this match. At the time of Steve's death, his net worth was actually $10.2 billion, which means there's a discrepancy of $8.2 billion. So where did this money come from? Disney participation. Well, ironically, although Steve Jobs was basically synonymous with Apple and the iPhone, 80% of his net worth was not even Apple, but actually Disney. After Steve Jobs left Apple in 1985, he invested not only in Next, but also in a small animation company called the Graphics Group. He bought the Graphics Group from George Lucas for $10 million in 1986, and that company would in fact become Pixar. Pixar's early days were quite difficult, but that would all change after the release of Toy Story in 1995. In the same year, Pixar went public at $22 a share. And it seems that excitement over the initial public offering was as strong then as it is today, considering that Pixar shares nearly doubled to $39 on just the first day of trading. Steve Jobs owned 30 million shares of Pixar, and at 39 per share, that totals $1.17 billion, making Steve Jobs a billionaire. Pixar will release many more box office hits, such as Monster S.A., Toy Story 2, Finding Nemo, and The Incredibles, significantly boosting Pixar's rating. In 2006, Disney approached Pixar with a takeover offer, and as we all know, it moved forward. Disney bought Pixar for $7.4 billion, of which $3.7 billion, or 138 million Disney shares, would go to Steve Jobs. So, contrary to popular belief, although Apple made Steve Jobs rich in its early days, in its last days it was actually Pixar that made him a billionaire, and the vast majority of his portfolio at his death was actually stocks from Disney. While Disney's shares haven't grown tenfold like Apple's, they've also grown substantially since Steve's death, growing quite a bit. Steve's 138 million shares of Disney stock are worth exactly $25 billion today. Adding that to his $20.43 billion stake in Apple, Steve Jobs would be worth $45.432 billion today, putting him 27th on the billionaires list. And the funniest part is that Disney would still represent the lion's share of your assets today. Other earnings. but that if he didn't receive or buy more Apple shares in the last decade. Steve Jobs didn't receive any Apple shares between 1997 and 2011, but that doesn't mean he continued to get nothing. He didn't get any compensation because Apple was passing through a difficult time, and he didn't want to burn the company down as much he could. Since 2011, however, Apple has become a dairy cow, earning more than $60 billion a year. So they could easily have paid Steve big stock packages, as they do Tim Cook, but Steve may have declined it on principle. Even if he continued to receive no stock compensation, he could have bought more Apple stock. Right after Steve's death in 2012, Apple started paying dividends, and by 2017, they turned it out to be the biggest dividend in the world. I'm not sure Steve would have allowed himself to earn dividends, as he probably would have preferred to reinvest that money in Apple. But maybe he's changed his mind, considering how profitable Apple is. If the dividends were to materialize, even with Steve leading the company, it is likely that Steve would use his dividend payments to buy more Apple shares, thereby increasing his share. Also, with Steve at the top of Apple, it's likely that Apple would still be super innovative. Apple managed to be extremely profitable without Steve, but they aren't as innovative as they used to be. Perhaps Steve Jobs continuing to lead the company would have corrected this, making the company even more valuable today. As a result, taking into account potential stock compensation, dividend reinvestment, and higher growth in Apple stocks, Steve Jobs would realistically be worth around $50 billion today, if not a little more. Perfect scenario. But before we finish this video, there's one more scenario we would consider just for fun. What if Steve Jobs had never sold his stake in Apple? In fact, it's quite possible that Apple would never have released the iPhone if it hadn't been for the time Steve left Apple. And it's likely that Steve wouldn't have been involved with Pixar if he hadn't left Apple. Nevertheless, for the purposes of this example, I'll say that he invested in Pixar anyway, and that everything in Apple progressed in exactly the same way, except that Steve sold his 11% stake. In such situation, it would be worth $273 billion, easily at the top of the billionaires list. But anger and circumstances had a different idea. But who knows, if Steve were alive, maybe he would have sold off his Disney stake and invested it all in Tesla in 2012, leaving you with over $300 billion today anyway. That's all for today, folks. What do you think about Steve Jobs' work? Share your opinion in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to our channel, leave your like and share with your friends. Thanks for watching and see you in the next time. Bye bye.